Good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking to our audience who we hope will be listening to this conversation and interview this afternoon. It's the 23rd of February, 2023, conversation with Lyd King. I'm Mike Byram, I'm a former professor of education at the University of Durham in England, and I'm accompanied by Dr. John Daniels, who's a former French teacher and head teacher of a school in Northumberland. Maybe, Lyd, you'd like to just say something about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, as Mike has said, I'm Lyd King. The name Lyd is actually a short version of Elidir, which is Welsh, which is part of my heritage, which we may or may not talk about. And I've been a lot of things, now pretty well retired, almost retired. I was a school teacher. I was a PhD student, a school teacher of French for about 14 years. And then I went to work in CILT, the Centre for Information on Language Teaching, also known as the National Centre for Languages, which no longer exists, very sadly. And that was also for about 14 years, a lot of them as director. And then I became National Director for Languages when England had a languages strategy, which is a very exciting part of my life. And since then, I've been running a small company called the Languages Company, which has been engaged in a lot of projects, mainly European, because there are not a lot of projects happening in the UK, which again might be a story we talk about later on. So that's me.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've got four themes or areas of experience we want Lyd to talk to us about. He's seen these in advance so that we give him some time to think, because of course in the relatively short time we have, not everything can be said. But we will be asking Lyd about his personal experience as a languages person, and then asking him to talk to us about language teaching in England or in Britain, perhaps more widely, and then what he thinks about the way in which that has developed over the years. And then we'll also come to his experience of international experience of language teaching beyond Britain. Those are roughly the areas that we will be talking about, and we hope that I'm sure that this will interest many people. So I'll hand over to John first for our first theme.
Yes, okay. Lyd, we've heard a little bit about your biographical background, but really looking at how you became a language person, what the first influences were. Was there a particular influence from a family member? Was it holidays abroad? Perhaps it was a teacher at school that started things off.
I guess it's like a lot of people, it's a combination of many things. Yeah, there were teachers. There was my Welsh grandmother, who was fascinating. There was experience of living in Africa when I was very little, learning a few cod words of Swahili. So the idea of different ways of seeing the world or describing the world was not alien to me. We started learning French quite young in school. But then I became fascinated more with ancient Greece at school. And that again was another world, another language. So all of those things combined, I think also it should be pointed out that we children of the 60s, as it were living in a different country from the one we're in now in many ways. And I felt very much part of I used to hitchhike around Europe, which is almost impossible to do now. Very much a community of young people who managed to communicate through whatever bits of languages they had. So that idea was not foreign or difficult for us. So yeah, it was opening a door to another world, which seemed then very natural, but also very exciting.
Right. Yes, I think obviously things have really changed. Do you see languages as the opening the possibility of escaping into another world where you're speaking this other language and you become part of something very, very different.
That's an interesting kind of juxtaposition, isn't it? Because on one level, yes, I think particularly when you're young, it's an escape. The idea to escape to the past through Latin or Greek, that was exciting, seeing different worlds, but also it was about connecting with the realities of worlds and seeing things from different perspectives and embracing that and thinking that's not a frightening thing, which unfortunately I think some English speakers do feel, but exciting. And I think it was particularly, I think from the age of 15, when I was 15, because of the classical education I had at school, I managed to have an exchange, not in this case with France or Germany, but with Greece, which in 1965 was very exciting. I mean, people were marching in the streets calling for reform, and Papandreou was the prime minister. All kinds of exciting things were happening. I was staying with a young Greek of my age, and that too was an eye-opener to what the different parts of the world. And in fact, interestingly enough, he's still one of my best friends after 50 years or even more than 50 years. So yeah, it was both an escape, but also an understanding of reality. Right,
yes. And of course, one of those things that you could do in those days was actually hitchhike.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know from my own experience that by hitchhiking, you do engage with other people. You have to.
I once hitchhiked. I always wanted to go to Greece, but decided one year to go through Italy, hitchhiking. And having had a few adventures on the way with some English girls in Germany, as one did when one was 18, 19, I found myself in Italy being actually, it didn't last very long because they didn't think it was great, but these Italian kids had a nightclub in an old building somewhere. And when they found out I was English, I had to go and sing Beatles songs for them. And then they gave up on me and found me a lorry to take me down to Brindisi so I could get the ferry. So yeah, all kinds of things happened on the road, as it were, which I think is quite understandably almost impossible. I mean, I drive around Europe a lot, and I don't think I've ever haven't picked up a hitchhiker except in a small French village for years. It just doesn't happen anymore.
Yes, it's really sad. I hitchhiked with the person who's now my wife, and it was a good way to get to know somebody.
Oh yeah,
a very good way. But you met the people who picked you up. Those are all the adventures of the weather and things you would encounter. Well, thanks very much. I think that's a very full answer. Mike, is that your turn?
Yes, thank you. I mean, you've told us about yourself as someone interested in languages and so on, but maybe we can also ask you about how you became professionally involved in languages. You said at the beginning you became a language teacher. Were there specific moments which pushed you into becoming professionally involved in languages?
One of the things I omitted to say in terms of the language experiences, in common with many of us, I think, I also happened to meet a French woman when I was quite young, and I've been married to ever since. So that also had an impact on my attitude towards life and languages. But in terms of professionalism, again, I have to say it's going back to that other country, because in many ways it was accidental. And I think this might have happened to other people as well. When I left university, after my first degree, I decided to do a PhD, which was actually it's a combination of modern Greek history, social linguistics, the kind of thing you could do in those days, which it can't be pinned down, but it was about the Greek language and the impact of the Greek language on the independence movement. And I had a whale of a time doing it, but then I actually had to find a job and didn't find one in any modern Greek faculty, but did find one in a school teaching French. And so it was an accident. And I found it quite challenging, quite interesting. And gradually, I think back in those days, the 60s and the 70s, anything seemed to be possible. We were, of course, you know, it's not the rose-tinted spectacles tell us it was a wonderful time. It was in many ways, but we were terrified of nuclear war. There were all kinds of strife and struggles going on, but it was a different place. Nothing seemed to be so critical as it does seem to be for young people now. We thought anything could happen, we could do anything. If it wasn't one thing, it would be another thing. And French teaching sort of fell into my lap, I have to be honest, to begin with, which is very strange in terms of what I became later. But if I tell you my first interview for a teaching job consisted of a phone call to a place, to a school in Dunstable, which was advertising for a teacher, a part-time teacher. Can you come for an interview this afternoon? Yeah, chat with the head teacher. Can you teach history? Yeah, well, I'm doing a PhD in history. What about music? No, sorry, I've got grade 3 piano, but I'm rubbish. It's okay, we'll change the curriculum. You can teach, can you do drama? Yeah, well, I've acted a bit. Okay, well, drama is now on the curriculum. That's how it went. My second interview for a proper French job was another chat with the head teacher in which we both decided to have a fag in the middle. So I don't think that would happen now. And that might seem very bad from one point of view, but from the good side of those times was that we could afford, we were allowed to make mistakes. So I went into teaching French, knowing nothing really about pedagogy, except what I picked up from my own teachers, who happened to be very good teachers, and an expectation that anybody could do anything, and irritation with what I heard in my first teaching job in Tottenham, in a tough school, where I would hear teachers say things like, you can't expect these kids. And I would say, yes, you bloody well can. And they can. But I made mistakes and I learned. Interestingly, I know, Mike, that you've been involved a lot in teacher training, and I don't want to belittle it at all. But I did discover one day that in conversation that myself, who became National Director for Languages, Barry Jones, who you remember, who was one of the most influential teacher trainers, and Ian Hill, who at that time was senior HMI, not one of us had a PGC or any qualification in teaching, because again, it was those times. If you were a graduate, you could teach and you learned, and there was not pressure. Obviously you were observed and you helped, and then you got interested and you found out things and you read. In my case, Eric Hawkins in particular, I thought this is fascinating, and you started going to courses and you developed, building on your past experience, your enthusiasm and your expectations, and also what you learned from the kids. I just came to mind that I had I think this is the experience of a number of teachers those times, that I was given a 5 set 3. 5 was, I still think in the old bunny, as they would say. So that's year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Anyway, last year of compulsory education, and a group of these kids, boys, all boys, black and white, tough, not interested, you know, not interested in French, not interested in education. But one of the best lessons we ever had, it just came out into my head as something to do, I think almost out of desperation, but it just showed me what was possible. We did a lesson of translation, but the translation was of Beatles songs into West Indian patois. And their attitude and their interest, and in fact their argumentation, was as vivid and violent as that of university professors talking about the best translation of Proust. They said, you can't say that, you've got to do it like that. That's wrong. It was brilliant. And I thought, well, there is something we're not getting here. And of course, that's a whole other strand in language education, which is not about a foreign, but about mother tongues and how do you incorporate. And a lot of the work that's been going on more recently, when it can, particularly in Ireland and other places, capitalizing on that existing multilingualism, plurilingualism that children have. And I know the Council of Europe, you've been involved in that a lot, has also been involved in. So it was I've gone off the point a bit of why I got into teaching, but all of those things just became interesting and exciting. And then you would read what Eric Hawkins was saying, his seminal book on languages in the curriculum. And I found out about this funny place called CILT, which was an unfortunate name, but read some of their things, went to some of their meetings, and started being somebody who amazingly who had fallen into this, who was actually giving back and organizing CPD. Oh yeah, and the other big strand that happened that time is did you ever come across Brian Hill at Brighton and work on using video and new technology, and all of that became something different. And being able to be in a classroom and then go back and try it out and do things was just great. So I probably enjoyed that part of my career as much as anything else. And it moved into a bigger interest in creativity and autonomy, and particularly more advanced language learning, what one could do with the post-16. And I was doing a lot of work in that area at that time, using all kinds of material, and became an examiner, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it took off from almost nothing.
Well, taking off from almost nothing and becoming what people used to call the languages czar.
Oh, yeah.
was a quite a career. I too don't have a PGC, by the way.
Sorry?
But that's another story. I don't have a PGC either.
Okay, well, maybe we should have a club.
But that's another story. So from your position as head of CILT and then as the advisor for languages at the ministry, obviously you could, I'm sure, tell us the history of language teaching over the last 20, 30, 40 years. But is there something in all of that? I'm now thinking about language teaching in the education system rather than your personal experience of languages. Is there something in all that you see when looking back as a major change or a major event? Is there one thing that stands out for you as?
I'm not sure about one thing, but I do think that, and again, this is, John Trim frequently used to say, young men have visions, but old men can only dream. And so looking back might just be dreaming about what the past was like. But I do think that, say, from the mid-80s onwards, up until the mid-noughties, were very exciting times in relation to language. The movement was forward. And I think probably if you're going to say, well, you've got to say one event, I think the one event is probably comprehensivization. And suddenly the idea that languages were for all and not for an elite. And that school in Tottenham that I was talking about was a very interesting case in point, because it had been Tottenham Grammar School. It was no longer Tottenham Grammar School, but as was the case that was in the 70s, the staff were a combination of the old grammar school staff, had certain expectations, and new and younger and quite dynamic staff who were looking at how, not just in languages, but right across the board, how do we develop a curriculum for all pupils, which is fair and useful for them. And so that really concentrated the mind. And out of that, I think, developed ideas such as the graded objective, how to reform the exam system, which was not fit for purpose, both at A-level and GCSE. The idea of graded objectives, which again resulted in these groups across the country of teachers working together, and how do we find ways for pupils to actually learn to progress, and how do we describe that description? And of course, that grassroots movement was influential in many ways through the development of new assessment tools, new approaches to languages, and indeed the input into things like the Common European Framework and ways of describing language, not in terms of how much grammar you knew, but in what you could actually do. Language acts, functions, notions, and all of that. That was, to the intellectual part of my mind, that was something that was coming along and being very fascinating. How do we combine all of that? And by the time we got to the 90s, which is when I was working in CILT, it seemed for a time that anything was possible. We managed to persuade the DFE or DFES or whatever it was at the time, because the name keeps on changing, the Education Department, to fund trials in primary languages. There was activity on diversification of languages. There was a fantastic project that I was directly involved in before I became director on languages and special needs. And language, that was something completely unknown to me, and it was something so inspiring and exciting right across the board. I mean, in those days, special educational needs were defined in different ways to what they are now. But for example, we were dealing with emotionally disturbed, I don't know how that's what the proper words for describing that is now, very difficult kids in schools, and languages could be almost like a therapy, because they were using a second language at a remove, and they were having to learn, you know how in French or German, one of the first things you learn for a language is how to say bonjour, hello, how are you, what's your name, just basic exchanges. Some of these kids never did that in English. So when they learned to do that, it did begin to change them, and things happened. It was very exciting. And at the other extreme, you would find kids who had almost no ways of communicating, but in a foreign language, they could use whatever they could to communicate by touching things or using. So very, very inspiring things were happening. That's just one example. And you think, well, we can really make languages part of, not just an interesting part of the curriculum, but something quite central, opening new possibilities, new worlds for kids. And that, I suppose, through CILT, and through the advent of the Blair government, who were actually quite interested, but it was not only them, just before that, the major government were quite interested in languages, but the Blair government went for it full tilt, and we had a strategy. I guess we'll talk about that, but whatever faults it had, having that framework was something that created enormous possibilities. So I can't even remember what your question was now. I think it was what was
well, the question was there one event in
the one event, I suppose,
so,
was comprehensivization, which led on to,
yes, you mentioned comprehensivization.
A whole process of change, because I guess I know this is a real simplification, because reading, for example, Eric Hawkins and others, there has been a lot of change in languages right back from Leith's report and in the 19th century. But my experience of languages was fairly static through the 50s and 60s. And then suddenly there was this explosion of possibilities, worries, and change, which led to a lot of very good things, which you've been involved in as well.
Well, yes, I mean, I've experienced some of those things. Graded objectives, for example. I was in one of those little groups that you mentioned, because at that time I was teaching in a comprehensive school myself. So some of that brings memories to me as well. But maybe I hand back to John. Some of the thoughts that we had would be the themes to discuss. Inevitably are anticipated, but maybe there'll be some repetition, but I don't think that matters. Obviously, we want to hear from you about your job when you and your experience when you were at the ministry. But I'll stop and hand over to John.
Okay.
John, you need to unmute.
I started teaching and was trained as an audiovisual language teacher in a middle school. And it was an extraordinary and a very exciting time. And what it was immersion. And this whole business of kids came in the classroom, they were given another identity with a French name and things. And you weren't allowed to say anything at all in English. Even if a kid collapsed, you had to do it in French and take them outside. So it was a very interesting time. But the point was that at that moment, and we come into the sort of political sphere a bit, languages were really important because we were looking at Europe and wanting to be part of it. And so for the only time in my career, 35 years and whatever, there was money available. There was special arrangements for language on the timetable. We had small groups. And for a little bit, it was very exciting, and we were like some special element in the school curriculum. But that faded, and I've talked. I think then there was a consolidating phase where, from my level, which is obviously completely different from your higher echelons and things, it became more textbook, more traditional, and began to conform much more to other subjects. And then, as you were saying, then you got the assessment process, the monitoring with the national curriculum. But I'm interested in your take on the political elements involved in languages and how they've changed things dramatically over the periods we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That I mean, do you remember there was a time when I think it was called the DTI then, the business ministry, had advertisements all over the place just before going into the single market aimed at business, all in a sort of phony French and German, basically saying, you've got to learn French, you've got to learn German, you've got to learn foreign languages.
Yes.
Foreign languages was a big thing, and it was quite easy to make the argument, which I think it is not easy to make now, about how important it was, because that was part of accepted knowledge, accepted truth, that we need languages. That was, what was that? Probably that was during my time at CILT that happened, in particularly. So around the 90s, and we were certainly, I mean, for example, in CILT, the Centre for International Language Teaching, during the 1990s, we had joint conferences with the CBI. We had a conference at which Prince Charles came to speak. We had activity on languages and business with Michael Heseltine and so on and so on. So it was much bigger stakes than anything that happens now. And that is very, what I was going to say is that I think that the political involvement is critical, but it's also a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is that the Blair government then came in and picked that up and ran with it and said, languages are important, we need languages in primary, not based on any particular knowledge, and just saying everybody knows that the earlier you learn a language, the better it is, without realizing that there's a whole debate about that question. But nevertheless, Tony Blair said it, so there we are. And they were very open to developing new ideas, because we need to be European. We need to be international. So that really, and I think we are probably also fortunate, the economy was not in a complete shambles, and there was money around. So that released money that had never existed before for doing things with languages. So that was great. And as part of the National Languages Strategy, which began in 2002, but not really till 2003, and went on for 7 and 8 years, a lot of very good things emerged from that. I think particularly about, for the very first time, I know this is a bit controversial, but I'll stick with this, a comprehensive strategy for introducing languages into primary schools. Now you can say, well, it's failed, hasn't it? And then to a large degree, that has not happened. But I think that was not because of the strategy, that was because it was not implemented. But everything had been thought through and everything had been costed, and there was possibility for doing all kinds of exciting things. I mean, I'll just give one example, which I was involved in directly, because I had a conversation with a minister who came to, this was when I was still at CILT, who came to CILT and said, what can we do? And this is it was Estelle Morris, no, it was Jackie Smith who had come on behalf of Estelle Morris. What can we do? And I said, well, there is a scheme that we're developing with our French, German, Spanish, Italian partners, which would be for, we called it formation croisée in French, joint, not exactly joint qualifications, but sharing of teaching of teachers, training of teachers. So that French teachers, Italian teachers, German teachers would spend time in British institutions and vice versa. And she said, that sounds like a good idea, let me think about it. And within 2 weeks, they said, yeah, we'll do that. And then the TDA was, somebody came from the TDA said, what do we do? How do we do it? I don't think that kind of thing happens very often now, but it was a fantastic scheme while it lasted. And that's the problem, while it lasted. So there were a lot of good things that happened. With we can go through the list if you want to. The sad thing is that many people have forgotten about these things, but we had a framework for primary languages worked on over a long time. We had the languages ladder, which was a development of the graded objectives idea, which became part of the assessment system. And we had the various diplomas, the idea of a diploma, which also was a very exciting new concept. All of that, of course, got thrown away in 2010. Not going into that yet. So a lot of those good things happened. When the downside, I think, though, of that political involvement is that it can turn, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about how all this grassroots activity was bringing teachers together, letting them talk, letting them think, working things out. The national curriculum nationalized it all. So you had a kind of top-down system, which of course has its merits, but then it is much more, it's much more controlled, much more difficult, and it does not release the same kind of energy and autonomy, in my view, among teachers. Now, we kept that for some time, but I have the impression that now teachers are weighed down with assessment and objective setting and paperwork, and are not allowed to do where I started. They're not allowed to make mistakes. And I don't think you can learn anything without making mistakes. And of course, you don't want to make too many mistakes with kids, but if you respect them and love them, then you can overcome that. But if you're weighed down by bureaucracy, that becomes more and more difficult. So I think it was a good thing that the politicians wanted to support languages. It was not so good that everything became nationalized. And then in particular, what was not so good is when, and I can't put my finger on when this happened, but there was a point at which the political world moved on from saying, we think languages are important, we want to support you, what shall we do? To, we think languages are important, and what you must do is teach grammar. And what you must do is learn the vocab. And that's where we got to. And once politicians start micromanaging, I guess in any area, or thinking they can, I think we have a problem. And I'll tell you a story about that. When I was towards the end of my period as national director, after the 2010 election, because I still had a contract until 2011, the then Minister for Schools, Nick Gibb, who is still Minister for Schools, called a meeting influenced by some people he knew, to discuss languages pedagogy, which was a very odd thing for a politician to do, but nevertheless he wanted to do it. So I was asked to bring a few people along and or name a few people who could be useful, and some other people came along the minister knew, and we had this discussion about pedagogy. But it became clear, although it went on for some time, and that was good, it became clear that the minister had a very clear idea of what he wanted. Because he said, yeah, this is all very well, all this communicative stuff, but I know when I learnt languages, I'm paraphrasing here, so don't quote it. I know when I learnt languages, there were two things I like doing, is having vocab tests and learning the grammar. Why don't you just do that? And that's, I think, where we got to now. That's what we do, isn't it? He also wanted to know when we did the pluperfect tense. So if ministers know what should be done in that kind of way, I think we have a problem of not unleashing the enthusiasm that people like I had when I was young. I'm sure there are very enthusiastic young people. I know young teachers, I know they are, but I think they are cramped by the system in which they're now working. I don't know if that answers.
I think that's, I'm afraid that's really true. Wasn't there some suggestion that I read somewhere that all the pupils, I can't remember what level, should know 7,000 words of vocabulary?
Yeah.
And this kind of easy, that takes away all the interest and enthusiasm in the language of learning, is just totally appalling. Yeah.
I mean, as soon as it is a problem of assessment. I can see I'm not a great assessment fan myself, but I realize it has to be done. But as soon as you define what you're going to assess, usually it has to be something not pretty specific, otherwise it's not fair. So that means you're asking teachers to teach those specific things. So whether it is 1,000 words of vocabulary, or whether it is using 5 tenses, or knowing how to use 5 tenses. And I actually saw it as an examiner, even back in those days. Sometimes you get a script from a kid writing their A-level guided essay, and in the notes page, there would be a list of all the things they wanted to include in the essay. 10 different tenses, expressions that they'd learned from advanced French vocabulary, something or other. It's a very interesting question. There's 2 sides of the medal, etc., etc. And they would list it all and then put that into an essay, which is a way of doing it, but it is not the most creative way. It doesn't suggest that they are feeling the language.
And I think you've done some really exciting work on creative language and the whole side of Eric Hawkins and Garding and Gale and all that, and the warnings were there. And yet it seems language keeps wanting to switch back to something that is measurable. And I mean, from my own experience, and I only had it for part of my time, the whole business about assessments and assessing spoken language skills is really complicated. And it's much easier to do the standard things. You do the writing, you do the listening, you do the, and my own experience is that a huge emphasis is on spoken vocabulary, on listening comprehension work, because that is an easy thing to test.
Yeah. Well, it is the problem with testing. So as I say, I'm not a great fan, and I can see why you need to do it. But I think we did one of the interesting things during the discussions about a new primary curriculum for languages is that we actually worked with people like Steve Anvil from the literacy strategy originally, and English strategy, and what was developed ironically in 2009-10 and was all ready to go into schools and then was thrown away or pulped or whatever, was a new description of the primary curriculum in which languages was part of communication. So languages and English were part of the same curricular area, which is obvious in one sense, but then having to work out, well, what does that mean, is a fascinating exercise. We only just begun that exercise, really. But also, I think there were things that we could learn from the way that English is assessed orally, which is not, ticking box, as I understand now. I mean, maybe it's changed. It's not ticking boxes about how many times you've used a particular word, or a particular tense, but the kind of descriptors that one uses in, for example, the Common European Framework about levels of competence, and the opinion inevitably has to be somewhat subjective. You can't objectify that but if you hear it, you know it. If you know when a kid or a learner is being fluent in a meaningful sense, and you can, but then that's a matter of experience to define it, which is another concern of mine, or belief of mine, is that I'll try and put this as clearly as I can. For the last 15 years, perhaps, there have been successive attempts, maybe even since the national curriculum began, bit by bit, to systematize the system to the extent that the autonomy of teachers is undermined. Therefore, teachers don't have that autonomy, but you are legislating for poor teaching, in a sense. Now, I've had that said to me by senior HMIs back in the day. He said, you don't realize how bad things can be, so we've got to say what the minimum line is for the national curriculum. I think that the critical thing to do is actually to develop the teachers, so the teachers do know what's good and what's bad and what's fluent and what's not that they rely on ticking boxes to tell them that. And that is something that I think has gone wrong with education generally, not just in languages, because going back to where I began, nobody bothered me for a couple of years. Don't think I did a terrible job, but I didn't do a great job teaching French. But we learned and we developed, and we didn't feel pressure, and we weren't ticking boxes, and we knew when it wasn't right, and we talked to people. So, and it was my first proper French teaching job. We were young teachers all working things out together, and I hope that still happens. Probably it does, but it's much more difficult.
I think if you ask a young person who's left school and you say to them, did you do French? And they will often reply, yes, I did, but I was rubbish.
Yeah.
And there is this sense of failure that the language learning they did just didn't do anything. And I think that is really sad.
Yeah.
Shall I come in now, and maybe we can move, to our fourth area we had in mind. Lyd, I know that you've worked with the Council of Europe, and no doubt in other countries apart from England or Britain. And in a sense, well, perhaps you'd just tell us a little bit about what your experience has been first, and then maybe the underlying question is what perspective that gave you on language teaching in England and Britain through that international experience.
Yeah, so you're quite right. I began working, I guess, from this funny idea came to CILT one day when I was still, was I director? I can't remember, but I probably was director at that point, about this thing called a portfolio, and these things called this Common European Framework thing, and would we be interested? And so I started going to a few meetings. I think the first one about the portfolio was in Ticino, in Italian-speaking Switzerland, which was a fascinating place, in the Monte di Verità, where a lot of very strange characters hung out in the early 19th century, like Bakunin and socialists from England. Anyway, that's another story. But it was very interesting to discuss, and that I was part of that process for, well, quite a few years. Sometimes it got a little bit bogged down again. It was going back to what I was talking to John about. It was, I think people were wanting to make portfolios so clearly defined and perfect that it sometimes ended up being, well, it led to some very interesting and sometimes very agitated arguments, but it ended up being very difficult to implement in that sense. Because I'm very much a believer in the kind of squinty-eyed approach to assessment. I mean, basically, you kind of have a look at it and you get an idea, and that's where you are. You can't define too much. But the portfolio it was used in very interesting ways, and it was very interesting to talk to all the colleagues who are very seriously engaged in that, but in particular in how can we make this mammoth biblical work called Common European Framework actually implemented in school kind of situations. And I think some teachers were able to do that, and that was very interesting. The other strand to what I did, in some senses, was more influential on my thinking or my development, was to be involved in some of the language policy profiles. Because after I finished, or even towards the end, well, obviously my time as National Languages Director got me in thinking a lot about policy as opposed to pedagogy, which has been my interest up till then. And how does policy work, and how do you influence politicians? Should mention in that respect Joe LoBianco, who was very influential on my thinking at that time, and his idea, a lot of ideas about how to develop language strategy, language policy. I like very much his idea of the 3 I's. I don't know if you've come across that, which is that to change policy, you have to address the 3 I's, which is interest, ideology, and information. Interest being what's in it for the politician, ideology being ideology, and information being what we spend most of our time doing as professionals, giving them arguments as to why languages are important. He said, well, that won't work unless you're thinking about the other things as well. It's a bit of an aside, but it underlines why how I became interested in this whole idea of language policy as opposed to just getting on with teaching and pedagogy. So I got involved in I was invited to take part in 3 in the end, languages policy profiles. And that involved, as you know, because I think you've actually done a review of all of these profiles as well as taking part in them. That involved a group of experts from outside the given country working with experts inside the country to look at to discuss what they wanted to talk about, because countries would ask for this to happen because they had an issue or some issues that they wanted to change or develop. And we would go spend some time there talking to people, talking to stakeholders, going into schools, talking to teachers, and jointly with the national experts come up with reports on what we think, with proposals as how to move things forward. And the first one I did was in Armenia, which was a fascinating place to go to in itself. And of course, that raised issues which have become, I suppose, even more relevant, sadly, in recent years, about an ex-Soviet country which was seeking to promote its own language, which had a long and, from that point of view, glorious history, alphabet, the Armenian language, in a situation where higher education in particular had been Russian, and in which English was having an increased influence. And how do you correlate those different language needs, which of course is something quite different from the situation in the UK. Well, perhaps not in Wales, but mainly so. And that was a very fascinating experience of seeing how they were dealing with that and how fluent many of the young children were, both in their own language, but also in Russian and in English, and to some extent in French. And we saw some very inspiring examples of that. And of course, there is a reason for that, which is one of the challenges for the UK situation, is that for many of those young people, languages were not a good idea. They were a necessity for economic progress, or for going to university, or for going to university somewhere else. So Armenia was a fascinating experience. We also had I also did a very interesting profile in Malta, where of course one of the big issues that came out there was the whole question of code switching, which is not something I thought about before, but it was very common in Malta for people to be switching from Maltese to English and sometimes Italian. And they were very concerned about this. And I'm afraid that the external experts, I'm not afraid, but rather threw the cat among the pigeons by saying it's okay. But switching is probably better than mixing. I think those kind of discussions as well. And this all got into the press. We were on television talking about, can you imagine being on the television, morning television, like Good Morning Britain and Good Morning Malta, talking about code switching, and was it okay, and so on. But and the ministers, everybody it was something very close, very important for them. The final one that I got involved in was aborted, and that also was an interesting experience about the power of languages. Catalonia invited us to do a language policy profile, and we finished it, more or less. So I've got the final draft, and the Spanish government made it, and the Council of Europe decided it had to be junked. It was political, because a number of reasons, which probably more prudent not to go into, but because of on the trivial level, because in the report we had talked about a Minister of Education in Catalonia, which is what they call themselves, and the Spanish government said there is only one Minister of Education in Madrid. Okay, we could have got around that, but it was more that we were very positive about the way that in Catalonia, both the Catalan language and the Spanish language were promoted. We were less positive about certain other aspects, but that was something which was politically unacceptable. So we didn't do it. So that again was a lesson for me about how important languages are, and I think we'll see the same, we're seeing the same thing, the same phenomenon now in Ukraine, where it seems that on the one hand, Russian speakers are trying to reject their Russian and to speak Ukraine. On the other hand, kids are being taken to Russia to become Russian speakers. So languages and identity, both the Maltese example and the Catalan example, show how this is not just, as it sometimes appears to learners of French and German in English school, something nice to have. It's something about who you are. And being able to adapt to a complex identity is something I think, absolutely critical for not just kids' futures, but actually for the world, that we can see the world in different ways with different spectacles. And that is not a bad thing, that's a good thing. So unfortunately, I think in our country now, we've regressed. And I noticed most recently, perhaps you haven't seen this, but it's an example, a very extreme example of what I mean, that it's been announced by the Home Office that asylum seekers will no longer have interviews. They will have to fill in a form of about 20 pages with some very complex questions in English, and they will have 20 days to do it in, otherwise their asylum claim may not be looked at, and they will not get any, they can use Google Translate if they don't understand the English. Now that's an attack on identity, which is just incredible. I know a lot of people have objected to it, but that seems to be okay as far as the Home Office is concerned. So this whole question of closing down of identities is something where the language teacher could be in the opposition, if they're allowed to be, to prove, to demonstrate that, no, this is a good thing. If you can see the world in different ways, that's a good thing.
That's fascinating how you've brought us to the much broader perspective, and how political all of this is, which of course is really very much part of the way I think too, but that's another story. But maybe we can just finish with the same issue about identity, but you mentioned right at the beginning your name, that is an abbreviated name of a Welsh name. Would you like to say something about your Welsh heritage, just to complete the full circle, as it were?
Yes, my grandmother, who was a native Welsh speaker, first, I mean, that was her first language, although she lived in England most of her life. So she would teach me odd words like mochin bida, which I believe means dirty pig, and just kind of rhymes like that sort of thing. Byram, which is a kind of funeral bread, I think. So that was interesting. But she was a lovely lady, and she used to watch Welsh television, and of course took me to Wales when I was in my 10, 11 to meet all of the uncles and aunts. And my recollection was, this is North Wales, that it was all about going to cemeteries, which is what I guess they like to do. But I did enjoy that, and I do very much identify with that Welsh heritage. But I'm going to have a problem this weekend because Wales and England are playing. I mean, I suppose I can cheat and support whoever wins. But that's the pleasant dilemma of the mixed heritage. I'm not sure which way it will go. The same thing happens with France now because of the family is French. And I think my son has decided he supports France rather than England. Certainly at rugby. I'm not sure about. No, I think at football as well. We were watching the. But that's okay. We can live with that. It's the other stuff.
Yeah, exactly so.
The idea that, somebody who can't speak English can't be a real asylum seeker, or there's something wrong with them. Why don't they speak English? I remember where I used to go a lot. We're a bit long in the tooth for it now, but I used to take my son a lot to football, international football, World Cups and European Cups. And that was a very good international experience, to mirror the experiences of youth in wandering around Europe and meeting people from across different countries. But it was noticeable how many of the English supporters were isolated, and that goes back to the kind of education they'd have, but both in terms of rather obscene songs, but I suppose a lot of footballers might do that, but of feeling threatened by foreignness around them. And not all. I mean, that is an exaggeration, and we haven't done such a bad job, but it is an issue, I think, for our education system, and that doesn't make me happy.
Well, that's a little of a sad note to finish on in a way, but it's a realistic note, and I think we must be realistic, and this is what these conversations are about. Is there, just to really finish, is there anything that you think we should have talked about? I mean, there's lots which we could have asked you about when you were working at the ministry, for example, and so on, but is there one final word that you would like to?
It's like an interview question, isn't it? So we've asked you, we didn't ask. I can't think, I guess the very young Kenyan experience was also something which influenced me. I mean, of course, it was the time of Mau Mau, not that I knew anything about that. My father was in the Royal Air Force, and of course they lived the life that they lived. And I had a Kenyan man who kind of looked after me, called Matiso, and he would teach me a bit of Swahili. He was a Swahili speaker. And I can remember him standing up to my dad, because my dad wanted to hit me. And that was a kind of positive experience. I think, oh, you know, this guy's okay. I don't know why that just popped into my mind now, but there are so many things, you see. Once you start thinking about things that happen, it can go on forever. So we could go on for another day, but I think that's probably enough.
Well, I think that shows us what a language person you are. Okay, well, thank you.